Hello everyone, welcome to the program War Commentary. Putin bitterly watches as Petersburg burns, Ukraine launches fierce attacks, and the Ust-Luga superport falls. Ladies and gentlemen, when the blue sky over Petersburg is choked by toxic smoke, the world realizes that Ukraine has just delivered a critical blow right to the economic lifeline of the Kremlin.
No longer just sporadic clashes, the Russia-Ukraine war has officially entered the living rooms of the Russian elite in the Baltic region. Why did the strategic Ust-Luga oil port become a pile of ashes overnight?
Is this an accident, or is it part of Kiev's plan to strangle global finances? As toxic gas clouds envelop and choke the air in St. Petersburg, we are witnessing a direct strategic shock aimed at the heart of the Russian Federation. The core of the issue has been revealed. Kiev has just carried out a precise strike on the port infrastructure along the Neva artery, a kinetic intervention so powerful that it turned St. Petersburg into unable to function normally in less than 24 hours. Now, the specter of a full-scale war has truly crossed the threshold of every Russian household, forcing residents of this historic city to face the harsh reality called Ukraine's long-range combat capabilities.
This concern is not emotional but based on cold military calculations, as Ukraine's UAV drone arsenal continues to maintain a high density, indicating a strong possibility of repeated strikes on Russia's northern flank.
While the city may be seeking shelter by the Neva River as a spiritual symbol, the harsh reality of modern warfare does not allow those prayers to come true. Right now, massive fires are raging on the water at the Ust-Luga complex, a crucial link located on the historic Neva River. However, the environmental and tactical consequences of that smoke are not limited to the port area.
When dawn breaks over St. Petersburg, people are not greeted by the freshness of a spring day, but by a thick chemical haze that makes it hard to breathe and covers the entire horizon. The usual hustle and bustle of this economic center has been replaced by an uneasy stillness, as from their windows, people can only see a mass of dark clouds that sunlight cannot penetrate.
For observers, the nature of the situation is all too clear. Ukraine's long-range UAV squadrons carried out a deep penetration mission, and the primary target was the Ust-Luga port, an extremely important hub in the Kremlin's oil export structure. Behind the information barriers, fierce flames are destroying the strategic port infrastructure and fuel tanks here. All that remains are smoke and destruction, and this is not just an internal matter for Russia. In the city of Narva, Estonia, about 25 kilometers from the Ust-Luga strike site, witnesses can clearly observe the collapse of this port infrastructure. Although the massive smoke column does not directly invade Narva's airspace from the border, it stands tall as proof of the technical success and deterrent power in Ukraine's long-range attack doctrine. In fact, Tallinn had a premonition about a similar scenario. The Estonian Defense Forces even declared a state of emergency when they detected unidentified flying devices. Initial concerns about a provocation from Russia against this Baltic nation quickly gave way to relief when the UAVs were identified as belonging to the Ukrainian military. Right after the warning signals ended, these devices approached and successfully neutralized their target. Ust-Luga is currently engulfed in flames, but the real dilemma for Moscow is Ukraine's continuous attack strategy. Analyzing the raid on March 29, the ANFA Special Unit of the Ukrainian Security Service (SBU) publicly claimed responsibility in the media for the operation targeting this key oil port. The statement from the ANFA Special Operations Center clearly stated that during the night, long-range UAVs effectively attacked the infrastructure of the Ust-Luga port in the Leningrad region. This report also confirmed a serious fire along with casualties at the scene. As for the Russian authorities, efforts to minimize the severity of the disaster are understandable. Alexander Rodenko, the governor of the Leningrad region, only gave brief reports about local damages. He tried to sway public opinion by focusing on the figure of 31 Ukrainian UAVs that he claimed the air defense forces had successfully intercepted over his province that night in order to maintain the image of a solid defense network. However, the reality at the scene told a different story. By 7 a.m., firefighters were still struggling in vain to control the fires, while the residents of St. Petersburg had to start their day coughing because of the toxic atmosphere. Detailed data from Newski showed that aircraft entered St. Petersburg at around 2:30 a.m. and headed directly toward Ust-Luga. Witnesses saw blinding flashes and heard 6 terrifying explosions that tore through the night. The initial shocks quickly turned into secondary explosions, with sounds described as no different from a barrage of artillery fire targeting military sites. At least 10 UAV systems were deployed, and some geopolitical theories suggest they may not have been launched directly from Ukraine. This detail will need more time to verify. As a result, Ust-Luga has fallen into a state of complete paralysis. By 4 a.m., the fire had spread to an area of more than 5,000 square meters. Although debris from the interception process was scattered throughout the area, the UAVs that penetrated the defense net caused an environmental and technical disaster, releasing toxic smoke filled with chemicals from exported petroleum products. Moscow was forced to suspend all commercial activities at Ust-Luga to prioritize rescue operations, and this is the worst-case scenario for Vladimir Putin. Reuters data shows this gateway handles around 700,000 barrels of oil daily. In 2025 alone, this port handled 32.9 million tons of oil for partners willing to take risks to buy discounted goods, helping Russia circumvent international sanctions. Ust-Luga is also a key part of the gas export strategy, with 18 huge storage tanks and 9 piers for 150,000-ton ships located right next to Gazprom's gas processing plant, according to Militani. Ukraine seized the chance to strike this vital point. On March 25, another attack crippled the facility, which has a capacity of 45 billion cubic meters of natural gas per year.
This is not a single incident, but a systematic war of attrition.
The people of Leningrad and St. Petersburg are living in a new reality full of anxiety as Ukraine continuously targets Ust-Luga as a focal point for firepower. What we are witnessing is literally the evaporation of millions of dollars in oil and gas revenue. Destroying storage facilities and processing plants causes immediate material damage and creates a logistical bottleneck.
When Ust-Luga are taken out of the operational equation, the flow of black gold is disrupted, causing costly delays and daily revenue losses as customers receive their supplies.
This is a manifestation of the systematic collapse of a leading industry under the relentless pressure from Ukraine's drone warfare. From the perspective of geopolitical analysts, the exhaustion of Ust-Luga is revealing fatal gaps in Russia's strategic defense system. This is no longer an isolated incident, as data from Radio Free Europe confirms that this is the third attack in just 1 week in which Ukraine has directly targeted Moscow's energy export lifeline. These ongoing attacks are clearly a deliberate move, timed for a critical moment on the global energy stage.
The Kremlin has taken full advantage of the volatility in the oil market since epic fury broke out in Iran, leading to the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and pushing crude oil prices above $100 per barrel.
Even when having to apply deep discounts to cope with international sanctions, Moscow still reaps huge profits, earning $20 to $30 more per barrel than forecast at the beginning of the year, creating abundant financial resources to sustain its war machine. Ukraine understands that they are forced to break this cycle of accumulation by launching successive strikes on key energy gateways. Ust-Luga is not the only target under pressure. The port of Primorsk, another important link on the Baltic Sea, has been targeted by Ukrainian UAVs, causing fires and forcing similar suspensions of operations. Through this, Kyiv is sending a strong message to Putin personally about the limits of Russian energy power.
There are two strategic implications being sent at the same time. First, Moscow will not be allowed to profit from global geopolitical instability caused by the conflict in Iran.
Second, Ukraine is proving that they have enough technical capability to strike targets deep inside Russia, far beyond any defensive scenarios the Kremlin had ever anticipated.
The scale of this latest attack is setting a new standard for destructive impact on Russia's core infrastructure.
At the Ust-Luga site, the attacks have caused serious damage to 2 main piers as well as the tank system and transformer substations, which are critical components in the process of pumping oil from land onto transport ships. From an operational perspective, Newski reports that there were 6 oil tankers in the process of loading cargo at the time the attack broke out, and all of them had to make an emergency escape. Currently, there are at least 15 other ships lying idle outside the bay, completely unable to dock in the near future. With the fire still raging, Ust-Luga is currently a deadly area. Any attempt to approach also means the risk of being burned by the extreme heat and the danger of death for the crew. Russian emergency services reported at least 2 port workers were injured and around 200 people evacuated from the danger zone. Leningrad province is currently on red alert. And the heavy pollution covering St. Petersburg is the clearest evidence that the war initiated by the leadership is now directly affecting civilian life, even if they are not directly present on the front lines. One notable point in this attack is Ukraine's novel deployment method. Usually we see long-range UAVs launched from Ukrainian territory covering a distance of more than 850 kilometers. Although this is a technically feasible feat if the data from Newski is accurate, the attack on Ust-Luga used a different scenario. This source claims that about 10 to 12 unmanned aerial vehicles were launched from the waters of the Gulf of Finland based on flight path analyses from FlyJada-24. According to this tracking system, Ukraine's UAVs chose to fly at extremely low altitudes over the Gulf to approach Ust-Luga. This technique helps them avoid detection by air defense networks at the seaport. Deep State, a reputable open-source analysis unit, also added the hypothesis that Ukraine deployed launch platforms at sea. This raises some extremely interesting geopolitical questions. Did Kiev actually send watercraft into the Gulf of Finland to carry out this mission? We know that Ukraine possesses unmanned boats like the Barracuda series that can launch FPV UAVs, but the scale of destruction at Ust-Luga requires much larger equipment. It's possible that Ukraine used secret patrol boats to infiltrate the Baltic Sea and carry out this launch. Another, even more controversial possibility is that Ukraine coordinated with a neighboring country. Newski suggested that Ukraine might have used the waters of Finland and Estonia to optimize the flight path. Although the alert issued by Estonia's defense forces suggests they were probably not directly involved, any support from NATO countries would escalate tensions with Russia to an extremely dangerous level.
The leading theory now is that Ukraine covertly moved equipment into the Baltic Sea and launched it from its own platforms.
No matter which scenario, Putin will be extremely angry. If there was outside assistance, that would be an excuse for Russia to accuse NATO, but if Ukraine did it on its own, it proves they have developed a tactical watercraft capable of striking deep into Russia. It means that all of Russia's strategic targets are more vulnerable than ever, and Ust-Luga is a small-scale preview of that collapse. So what are the real consequences? We should consider the Baltic oil and gas network and its social impact in St. Petersburg. On the Baltic front, Kyiv is launching a full-scale economic blockade campaign, not just stopping at Ust-Luga or Primorsk. On March 26, reports indicated that Ukrainian UAVs attacked the Kirishi Petroleum Organic Synthesis Refinery in the southeast of St. Petersburg.
This is a key facility producing gasoline and diesel oil for both the military apparatus in Ukraine and for commercial export.
We are seeing a coordinated effort to destroy all oil infrastructure in Russia's Baltic region.
The reason Ukraine is targeting this area is very clear.
After operations at Novorossiysk in the Black Sea were restricted by naval firepower, the Baltic Sea became the largest and last economic lifeline that Moscow is desperately clinging to.
The Kremlin is currently haunted by the fear that Ukraine's drone teams will continue to carry out successive attacks.
Similar to the strike that crippled oil unloading operations at the ports in early March, when the main gateways in the Black Sea were disabled, Kyiv made a strategic shift to infrastructure in the Baltic Sea, a region that observers believe is far more vital to Putin's power structure. The synergy between the Ust-Luga and Primorsk links is handling a massive proportion of Russia's total oil exports, turning them into critical choke points that determine the ability to maintain foreign cash flow. Moscow has almost no viable alternatives, especially when facing the strict demands of the European market. Although Russia owns seaports in the Pacific and the Arctic ports are often frozen during the winter, and both of these areas force Russia to solve a difficult logistical problem, as fuel must be moved overland for thousands of miles before it can be loaded onto ships.
The Baltic region has always been a key strategic card since Putin launched the military campaign.
To understand why this area is the focus, we need to look at the cold, hard numbers. Russia is now making about $760 million a day from energy, largely due to Iran restricting the Strait of Hormuz and raising oil prices. A simple geopolitical analysis shows that 40% of that $760 million, which is about $304 million, is surplus value that Russia simply cannot convert into cash as long as Ust-Luga and Primorsk are disrupted by explosions and fires caused by Ukrainian UAVs. If the infrastructure recovery process is delayed for just 1 week, which is an optimistic scenario for Moscow, the loss will be $2.128 billion in goods value being held up. If calculated for a 1-month cycle, the economic loss will reach $9.12 billion. And in the case that Ukraine is able to maintain fire pressure on Ust-Luga and Primorsk throughout an entire year, Putin's budget will suffer a deficit of nearly $111 billion in oil value, a massive financial hole that will force the Kremlin to frantically search for alternative export routes. However, the actual capacity barriers at Russia's remaining seaports have exposed a harsh reality. When the Baltic gateway closes, this black gold can't cross the border to bring in foreign currency.
Russia cannot expect to reroute millions of barrels of oil to other routes without causing a cascading logistics breakdown. What Ukraine is doing at Ust-Luga and across the entire Baltic is a lever to eliminate Putin's opportunity to profit from the market fluctuations caused by Iran.
These attacks were clearly timed due to high-level tactical planning. Energy analyst Boris Aronstein also reinforces this view, stating that the scale of the attacks in the Baltic is the most serious existential threat to Russia's oil and gas export infrastructure since the conflict began. However, for the residents of St. Petersburg, the consequences go beyond just the economic figures on Putin's balance sheet. It is a terrifying form of psychological warfare as they directly witness Ukrainian weapons striking right in the heart of the city, creating thick black columns of smoke that can be seen from dozens of miles away. These deadly chemical trails are pushing PM 2.5 fine dust levels up to 15 times the safe threshold, directly choking the air across the entire region. In areas like Vasiliostrovsky and Petrogradsky districts, toxic gases are seeping into every air conditioning system, infiltrating private spaces where residents are hunkering down in fear. In the harsh reality of war, this damage to health may seem less terrifying than the growing fear over the fragility of the defense system in the minds of St. Petersburg residents. Communities are being isolated by the government's efforts to cut off connections, creating information chaos that has reached Russia's nerve centers. According to a report from the Kyiv Independent on March 22, these outages are the result of the Kremlin establishing a new whitelist system. This information control mechanism only allows access to propaganda platforms and official government resources. Therefore, citizens in St. Petersburg can only receive filtered news, which will never acknowledge the disaster in Ust-Luga. When a cloud of chemical mist is hanging overhead, being deprived of access to truthful information is nothing short of a bitter form of psychological torture. Even the most steadfast supporters of Putin now have to face the chilling reality. After all, being surrounded by propaganda narratives is one thing, but having to breathe toxic air while the nation's economic pillars are burning, yet still believing in the Kremlin's ability to protect you, is an entirely different psychological challenge. Ukraine is betting on this fracture. Sowing insecurity within Russian society is expected to create enough internal pressure to force Putin to reconsider maintaining the so-called special military operation.
Ust-Luga can be considered a critical blow to the Baltic lifeline, and Kyiv has carried it out with absolute precision.
However, its true impact will be felt most clearly through the erosion of trust on every street corner in Russia, not just at the ports. Is the secret oil and gas gift President Trump mentioned an under-the-table deal, or just Iran's delaying tactic in your view?
What would happen if Iran insisted on the right to collect fees at the Strait of Hormuz?